What do you think the Prime Minister really thinks about Gary Lineker and his refusal to back down on likening the stop the boats policy to what was happening in Nazi Germany in the 1930s?
It's an extraordinary comment for someone who is the highest paid star at the BBC to have made. But perhaps what's even more extraordinary here is the fact that there's been no contrition, no walking back. In fact, there has been a doubling down on this sort of sentiment, this inflammatory rhetoric from Gary Lineker. We saw that yesterday he posted on his Twitter page to 8 million followers. No apology to the people that he has really painted in such a peculiar light, or indeed the vast majority of the country who are supportive of what the government has been saying over the last few days.
I am. We're supporting it.
It's extraordinary. Instead of
We're not
walking,
fascists.
Instead of walking back from this sort of language, Gary Lineker has doubled down, saying he will say more things like this. And it wouldn't be a problem if he were a private citizen. It wouldn't be a problem if he were employed by a non-state broadcaster. But the fact that he is funded through the licence fee, which people are forced to pay if they want to watch live television, the fact he gets over £1 million a year, 1.34 million, if I remember correctly, a year from that, does place certain responsibilities on. And it's interesting listening to what some other employees at the BBC have been saying. If they were casting political opinions like this, if they were talking in such an inflammatory way, there is no way they would be given such lenience by the BBC establishment.
Nick Robinson, who's one of the presenters of the former political editor and on the Today programme, effectively saying he'd be sacked if he said something like that.
Absolutely, and you can go through a whole list of people who have said not only would they be sacked if they were talking in those terms, but I think even more pertinently, if there were perhaps even a sports broadcaster who would have taken the other view, who would have said something inflammatory on the asylum seeker point of view, you can bet your bottom dollar that that person would be sacked and barred from working in pretty short order. It seems that it's one rule for one side and perhaps another for the other. Tom,
thank you. Let's get some more analysis now from the former Labour MP who's the independent peer House of Lords, Lord Mann. Lord Mann, can Gary Lineker keep his job?
Well, I'm for free speech, so I think that's a distraction, a bit like Jeremy Clarkson, who used to say things occasionally made me squirm, some of the things he said and wrote, but he was a very good presenter of Top Gear, which I seem to recall was a BBC programme. So I'm for free speech. I don't think that's the issue here at all.
Is it free speech when we're paying him 1.35 million? It's not free. We're paying for him.
I don't know how much Jeremy Clarkson got paid. I think a reasonable amount, from what I gather from the past. And so I'm in favour of free speech. This idea that there's obviously a difference between a news reporter and a sports presenter or a car programme presenter. And I'm for free speech for everybody. I think the idea that we restrict free... there's been loads of work in the universities about free speech, but I've been arguing the case for years that the way you deal with people saying stupid things or problematic things is not to ban them from speaking and close them down. In our country, free speech is part of what we're about, and whether people agree strongly or disagree strongly or don't care, I'm for free speech. So no, I wouldn't have sacked Jeremy Clarkson before, and I wouldn't sack Gary Lineker.
Do you think it's different under this Director General, under Tim Davie, John, at the BBC, that he gives them a little bit of a longer leash, some of the celebrities?
I'm not sure it's different. I mean, I think that the language is a bit different from the top of the BBC, from people like Tim Davie. But in the past, the BBC have allowed... Jeremy Clarkson is a classic example, because he said many things which some people regarded as controversial, others agreed with strongly. And I think he rather, a bit like Lineker, he rather relished some of the controversy. But the idea that you'd sack either, they're not news reporters, not presenting the news. They're not the political analysts of the BBC. So I'm for free speech. Where Mr. Lineker got it wrong, and some others have in responding to him as well is, I mean, my advice to politicians, to government ministers, but to everyone in wanting to comment is, don't use these analogies with the Nazis, with Nazi Germany. I think it debases our language when people do. It's always hyperbole. I mean, Lineker's was relatively mild compared to plenty I've seen, but nevertheless, don't do that. It doesn't actually advance your case. It's a distraction to it. And, he's made himself the story by doing that, much more so than if he hadn't. I'm not sure what's achieved by that, other than a crassness and a carelessness in the use of language. So my advice to him and others, I noted your new presenter, I believe a Mr. Anderson, a Conservative Vice President. I believe he now works for, I read anyway, that he's now going to be a presenter with you. Well, he immediately railed in using the word Nazi. Well, Mr. Anderson, don't you do that either. I mean, he was actually had to be re-educated by the Conservative Party for doing the same sort of thing before the last election. He obviously wasn't listening to the training and probably should go through it again. Perhaps I could do training for Lee Anderson and Gary Lineker to understand why you shouldn't use this kind of comparator. It debases language and it doesn't help your argument. Don't do it.
Stephen Pollard, who's the former editor of Jewish Chronicle, you all know Lord Mann, he says what Lineker says is so truly offensive, particularly to people like him who's lost relatives in the Holocaust, and to use any comparison with Nazi Germany, he says, is unacceptable, and that's why, in his view, Lineker has to go.
Well, Stephen Pollard's absolutely right in terms of expressing a view, I think, held by a lot of people in the Jewish community, and certainly the majority of comments. I think people are discomforted, to say the least, when people use these analogies. I mean, my view, I disagree with Stephen on free speech. My view is that we should have free speech, and the Jeremy Clarksons, the Gary Linekers, if I was them, I'd tone it down. I certainly would never be using this kind of language or anything similar, but I see no problem in a car reporter, presenter, or a football presenter having a view on things, because I believe in this country free speech is of the essence, and it's exactly the issue that in my official capacity, appointed by lots of prime ministers now, 3 or 4 prime ministers, appointed by government to do, I've been taken into the universities, which are, as you can imagine, a rather heated debating chamber at times, and argued the case for free speech. And I think that's paramount in our country. And so I give that, whether people say something stupid or not, I'm still for free speech.
OK, thank you so much, Lord Mann, for joining us. Joining us now for more analysis is political editor of HuffPost UK, Kevin Schofield. Good morning, Kevin.
Morning.
Good morning. What's your assessment of this? Was Gary Lineker to say what he thought? Should we have free speech at all costs?
Oh, yeah, I'm certainly in favour of free speech. I mean, I think you have to be very careful in using analogies about Germany in the 1930s. I think I wouldn't go there personally, and I think that when you do that, you do open yourself up to criticism. I think there's an important distinction to be made as well, though, that he wasn't actually comparing the government's policy to Germany in the 1930s. He was talking about some of the language being used around the policy. I think that's an important distinction, which appears to have been lost in the heated debate which has followed. On the question of whether he should be sacked, Andrew mentioned Nick Robinson earlier, saying that he would have been sacked had he tweeted something like that. I think you're kind of comparing apples and pears there a little bit. Nick Robinson, obviously, is a very esteemed former political editor of the BBC, as a Today programme presenter, regularly interviews politicians. He needs to be politically impartial. I think Gary Lineker, as a presenter of Match of the Day, isn't in the same position. So I think there is a difference there, and I think that may well be why Gary Lineker hasn't been sacked, and I think probably won't be sacked.
Jonathan Agnew, who is one of the BBC's cricket correspondents, has said some of the stuff he said before would have meant he'd be sacked, Jonathan Agnew, but he thinks an exception is made for Lineker because of his huge popularity, and he is undoubtedly hugely popular and very good at what he does.
You know, I think Jonathan Agnew might be making a good point there. I think there's certainly something to be said for that. Obviously, Gary Lineker has 8.7 million Twitter followers, I think it is. So obviously it is a huge social media presence, very well-known face on the television, and the BBC can probably see benefits in having him as the face of Match of the Day. As I say, I think the tweet itself probably was a little bit ill-advised, just going there and, as I say, comparing even the language to Germany in the 1930s. It was very controversial, and I can understand why people are getting rather upset about it. Other BBC employees clearly take a different view from Gary Lineker. They recoil really from getting involved in politics. He's a different case. He chooses to get involved. He's done it consistently for quite some time now. So that's why I think, you know, it would be a surprise to me were the BBC to turn round now, given this is just the latest in a long line of political interventions that he's made, that they would turn round and sack him now.
Mm.
Tim Davie, who's the Director General, Bev was referring to him earlier, he said in September 2022, Kevin, Gary Lineker's tweeting is a work in progress. Well, this is probably one of his most contentious tweets, and he doubled down on it when people criticised him yesterday, and he said the cancel culture are trying to close him down.
A work in progress is certainly one way of describing it. I mean, clearly the BBC are concerned about this. I think it led the BBC 6 o'clock and 10 o'clock news last night, which was pretty extraordinary. And I think I can understand why the BBC want to speak to Gary Lineker about it. Obviously, that's a conversation for the two of them to have. The point I was trying to make is that this is not a one-off from Gary Lineker. He has consistently made his political views clear on Twitter. And up until now, the BBC have, you know, they might have had some discomfort, but they have not disciplined him over it. I think I would be surprised were they to now draw a line in the sand and say, you've gone too far this time. I think it would be an interesting conversation where that actually happened between Gary Lineker and BBC bosses. But as I say, at the end of the day, I'd be very surprised if he was to end up losing his job over it.